Hey, this is Luke with Out of Darts. Today I'm going to show you how to modify your Worker Hurricane. The Worker Hurricane is a really fun little blaster. It's very unique in that there is no comparable blaster out there other than the one that was made by who's the actual likely creator in China. It's a 6-dart cylinder. It is super fun because it's compact, it's holsterable, and it also can pack quite the punch. Now today I'm going to run you through how to modify it to a single stage setup. That means just one cage, but you do have the option of doing a dual cage. This is the Cat-3 and Cat-5 Hurricane cages. The Cat-3 is obviously single stage, Cat-5 is 2 stages. Both of these were designed by my friends, the ladies over at Foam Blast. We license and pay them for each one of these that we sell because there's so much out there to design. Why redesign something very similar to someone else when you can just bring them into the party, so to speak? To complete this mod, there are a number of things you're going to need. Let's start with the tools. Obviously, you're going to need solder, soldering iron, safety glasses, potentially tip cleaner if you like it. I like to keep a little bit of water around for my sponge. You're going to need a heat gun, or you can use the side of your soldering iron just for heat shrink. Helping hands are extremely helpful. Hey, that was a good joke, right? You'll probably want pliers. They almost always come in handy. Wire strippers, a number 0 or number 1 screwdriver, and that will do it for tools. As far as supplies, we're going to do a 3S build today. It's worth noting that this blaster comes out of the box ready for IMRs or 14500 batteries, such as our Cool Look batteries. So in its stock configuration, it'll work with those right out of the box. However, we are going to upgrade the motors to Krakens, which are 3S. We're going to upgrade to the serrated wheels, which increase performance substantially due to their grip on the dart and larger diameter. We are going to use this JNB 550 milliamp battery pack. It's worth noting that this has an XT30 rather than the traditional XT60, so you will need an XT30 connector as well. I'm using the bare bones connector today, but we do also sell one that's pre-soldered with leads, so those will both be linked in the description. We'll have a full build kit listed down below of my recommended builds for both versions of these blasters. The Cat-5, if you do choose to go this way, is quite a build. It does require a considerable amount of effort and a lot more dremeling. If you'd like to see a great video on someone walking you through this, Zach over at Naptown Nerf, a friend of mine, he did a really great video on this using my high power MOSFET board. I'm going to set that cage aside because that's not the build we're doing here today. This blaster has a rather unique firing mechanism, and I think 3D printed users probably did this before Worker did, of course, but the switch is essentially depressed while you pull the trigger. So the mechanical trigger fires the blaster, and I love that this is clear so you can really see this work. That fires it, but at the same time, you've got a switch in here that is literally depressed by the pusher. And what this lets you do is the second you pull the trigger just a little bit, you're going to get a, if you can hear that click, that will start it revving. And so instead of using the common and normally open tabs, you're actually using the common and normally closed. So when you are releasing the switch, you are opening the circuit. Now that switch that is in there is actually only rated for about 5 amps. So if you upgrade and keep that stock switch, you will probably have it fail. One option is to upgrade to a 10 amp switch, which has about twice the current, as you could guess, going from 5 to 10. This is still possible to burn out, so it's worth noting that I am going to go a different route with this build. We are actually going to keep the stock switch, and we are going to use our itty bitty MOSFET value board. This board is everything you need for the MOSFET all on one little board, and it is labeled here for the motor, the switch, and the battery. So you simply solder up your battery, solder up your motors, and solder up your switch, and you are ready to go. It makes upgrading this blaster really easy, and at a $5 or $6 price point, it's also a pretty affordable way to go. Now that said, if you want to simply just swap out the switch for a DB2 lever switch, this is a Cherry brand switch, that is also an acceptable solution, and it will power the Krakens just fine, but if you do experience a jam or over heavy extended use, you may find that you burn the switch out. That being said, I have done plenty of blasters with the DB2 switches prior to knowing about the larger ones or having them in stock on my shop. You'll also need wire, of course. There's an optional jumper connector for the PCB. That is the MOSFET board. PCB is printed circuit board, if anybody is wondering that. I realize I should actually clarify. This allows you to use a modular connector when connecting to the switch. So this little connector will go on here, solder on, and then add the connector. Now, I haven't actually done the MOSFET mod for this, so you're walking through this with me as I learn it, and I will try to keep this edited as succinct as possible, but I will not be editing anything out. That seems to be the most common request, is just to make sure that all the steps are very clearly shown. One of the hard parts about doing these mod videos is that when I get done with them and they get tens of thousands, or if I'm lucky, maybe they get 100 or 80,000 views or something, that can end up being hundreds of emails, people asking for clarity, diagnosis, troubleshooting, that sort of thing. So I'm trying to be as thorough as possible. In addition to those parts, you will also need, or probably want, some heat shrink. You will need a LiPo alarm, and you will need cage screws. I'm also going to show an extension because for me, this blaster is a little bit small on where my fingers rest. I don't really like the wraparound, so this slides right on, filling out that grip nicely. I just picked a color that would be easy to see, but I'll show the install at the end as well. While we're talking about LiPos, it's again worth noting that LiPo batteries can be dangerous. They can cause fires, they can cause explosion. They must be charged before their first use, and you must not overdrain them. If you overdrain them, you will have a piece of garbage. Please use LiPos carefully, be safe, and make sure you read our entire guide that I have linked below. We also have several videos on LiPo Safety. I would recommend watching them all, especially if you're new to this. They are very safe if you are careful and do as directed. So do read your manuals for both the battery, read our documentation, and read your charger documentation. So let's get right down to it. So the first thing we're going to do is take our screwdriver and get this blaster open. We can remove the magazine because we're not going to need that. It's also a good time to turn on your soldering iron if you haven't already done so. I have some terrible habits when it comes to soldering iron. Soldering iron is on and I walk away. First person to comment in the comments that's gotten this far and knows that reference is going to get a t-shirt, and hopefully my video editor will catch the comment in case I don't. But whoever's first, someone's got to know that. At least I hope so. All right, so we're going to take our shell off. This shell doesn't need to be modified. This should actually be good to go all the way to the end. So I'm simply going to set this off camera and just keep visible what you all need to see for the mod. We can also set this base off. Next, we're going to take out our flywheel cage. We're going to pull this little barrel out as well because I am going to replace this with the other one. That's not totally necessary, but I do think the tighter fit of the aluminum and low friction does seem to help in my general testing with long darts, since these are going through short flywheels. And in case you're wondering what's going on there, the concept that's been proven by Philip over at OFP is that when darts go through flywheels, they get distorted. And the idea behind this is that we're cleaning up that trajectory and making them fly a little bit straighter. Now, depending on the flywheel cage and setup, you can find out whether that's helping or not by simply removing it and testing, but we're going to end up using that ultimately. So we're going to pull this flywheel cage out. We are working on our mod setup here at the warehouse and trying to get a nice clean setup to get you all the best possible view and the best possible clarity we can. So I'm looking at a monitor here, trying to get comfortable with where I'm looking and what my hands are doing, and trying to keep things at an angle where you can all see them versus good luck seeing that, huh? So once you've got your 4 screws out, you'll want to pull your cage out. Now, I did just edit out a chunk here. I had to pull on this with a fair amount of force, so it might stick a little. Just know that that's a potential, and I'm not entirely sure why that is. Now is a good time to mention another component that's here. You'll notice I just pulled out this little switch lock here. And that's an electronic lock, and what that does is make sure that you can only rev it when there's a magazine inside, and that prevents you from shoving your fingers inside the flywheel and injuring yourself, which personally I think is actually a great feature. So I don't see any reason why you couldn't take it out or why you couldn't leave it. Now the reason I'm going to take it out is I have been using these blasters in a game and literally held the blaster up, revved, and shoved a dart into the flywheel to shoot at somebody because I didn't have the time to reload. And for me, that was a functional, positive feature. So I am going to remove it and not keep this in here, but it's good to know that if you're, say, making this for a kid or someone who might stick their fingers in there, or you're gonna hand this to a kid, good idea to take care of that now. The next thing I want to mention is this little component here. This is called a PTC, which is essentially a resettable fuse. It works on current going through it, and it'll overheat and clamp down on that current. Now what that does is if there is a jam in the flywheel, like let's say this dart, you get a massive dart jam and somehow you've just really wedged this in. If that were to happen, the motors are going to put out the most pull the most current that they've ever pulled, and they're going to overload this, and the whole blaster will clamp down and stop working. Now normally, if you were not upgrading this, I recommend leaving that in because it's great. If you're going to use IMRs or just 2S LiPo, this is still fine to keep in. However, if you're going to go to Kraken's or 3S LiPo or upgrade the motors at all, essentially, the current will be too high for this one to match. We are working on sourcing these for our shop, but it requires quite a bit of an extensive testing to figure out which ones work with which motor sets. Because if you don't do it quite right, after say a couple dozen shots, you might have it clamp down when you don't want it to. So we will be removing that. So there are 2 primary ways to approach the wiring with the MOSFET, and the 2 ways come because there are actually 2 switches. One is a master on-off switch, which I actually think is a really nice feature. The other is your actual switch. Now, you could simply run from your battery into your master on-off switch to the MOSFET, and then MOSFET to the switches, MOSFET to the motor, MOSFET to the battery. However, I don't think this switch will hold up over time. If someone were revving, that is activating the firing switch while and then accidentally touch this switch on and off, you would probably burn that out immediately because it's only 1 amp. So what I'm going to do here is I'm actually going to wire both those switches in series to the MOSFET to the flywheels, and the MOSFET to the battery. So our first step here is going to be to start clipping wires. We can go ahead and clip off our cage because I'm going to replace those wires. Now, if you wanted to, you could reuse the wiring and hodgepodge it all together, but since I have other wires, I'd like to keep it kind of clean in wiring here. Next, I'll go ahead and just clip this battery tray out because we're not going to use that. Those are kind of handy for other projects. You might come up with something where it's actually useful, so I'd usually hang on to that sort of thing. Now, these 2 wires are already connected in series to each other because the power originally goes in from here to the first switch, to the second switch, and then back out to the motors. So what we're going to do is just pull this guy up, and we're only going to desolder the top one. This is a good time to put on your eye protection. Anytime you're desoldering, it's generally easiest to apply a little bit of solder. I need to prep my tip, but I'll go do this on screen for you guys. What happened? I don't think that's going to do it. You guys are going to laugh. My soldering iron says 360. It went into sleep mode. So that's not going to do us. So I've got to wait a moment for that to come up to temp. Okay. All right, so we're going to start by desoldering, and I'm just going to tin my tip a little bit here. Anytime you're desoldering, it can help to apply a little bit of solder to the tip before doing so. It's worth noting that the middle terminal there is the one we want. The top terminal there we're going to leave just as it is. So those two switches are currently connected. That's what we want. Next, we're going to take this terminal, or wire rather, and we're going to desolder this one as well. And lastly, pull out this long black wire. For illustrative purposes, I am going to go ahead and replace all of the wiring. I'm not going to keep anything intact from the original wiring aside from this one connection. I want to show you that nice and close in case you were not able to see it. Because I know for a lot of people, even myself, I like seeing things visually, and that's a lot easier than a diagram for me, even though I do create diagrams, and I will have a diagram for this one as well. So now we're going to take our MOSFET and do a little bit of prep work to get us to the point where we'll be ready. You want to be careful not to clamp on any actual connectors. I would generally recommend clamping on one of the actual terminals while you're not connected to it. Hopefully that makes sense. So I'm going to first connect our JST connector. Now this is your switch terminal, those two smallest terminals there. It does not require using this connector. You can simply solder to them directly, but I think I'll go ahead and do that. So you basically plug that connector in, and then you go to the back side. This shouldn't take much solder. Important that those do not touch when you're done with them. That was probably a tiny bit more solder than I needed, but it'll be just fine. So now for the actual switch, all you'll have to do is plug it in there and then wire the other ends of the switch to the two terminals on the switches. We'll do that in a minute, but we're going to prep the other leads here first. So we're going to use 18 gauge wire here. I have stripped the ends of both a positive and negative, positive red, black negative. It's easy if you just do everything the way you're supposed to, so you're not guessing later. You can push these through the hole from the top or from the bottom. I'll push them through the bottom like this, give them a tiny bend, and then make sure there's not too much excess sticking out. You don't want that touching any other component or possibly causing a short. And I'm hoping that you can see this with enough detail. We'll do one side then the other. All right, that looks good. And then we'll do the same on the other side. And actually, I've really cut these a little bit long. So I'm going to go ahead and snip this so it's only about 4 millimeters long. And then again, put that up through that hole. And I'm going to confirm again. These are actually the motor leads, but that's fine. It's irrelevant. As we'll do one, we'll prep all 4. Right. And so that's the motor lead completed. Now we're going to do the battery, marked BAT. Same thing there, but I'm going to clamp onto the, you're always safe clamping onto the actual solder terminals, even if it's over another wire. Just want to avoid clamping onto the actual MOSFET, which is right there, or the diodes and resistor. I don't know if you hear my OCD here. I just grab switches and click them. Let me know in the comments if you do the same, because I'm kind of feeling a little crazy every time I do it, but it's very satisfying. I'm going to take those wires we had here and just make sure I leave enough slack to get to the motors, and then I'm going to cut them short. And again, I'm going to strip 2 pieces of wire reasonably short so that they'll fit those small terminals. And as you can see, the 18 gauge is definitely the maximum you would ever want to use on this. Any bigger and you would heavier gauge, you would never get it into the terminals. You can also solder directly to the surface, but I find it a lot easier to shove them into the holes. It just ends up being cleaner. And what I mean by surface is you can set them on the surface like this and then solder. But to me, it always has seemed a little easier to use the mechanical connection of plugging one in. Well, that's a weird thing. We got a phone call. We don't get a lot of phone calls because our number is not public. It's not a customer service line, but we do offer local pickup. So if you do a local pickup, you end up with our phone number, just in case you have any problems. We're in Vancouver, Washington, so if you happen to be watching this and you're within reasonable driving distance, we do allow for local pickup at no charge, and someday we'll do shop tours, but for now, with the situation, we are definitely not. All right, so as far as the MOSFET goes, we are done. We've got our motor lead over here on the left side, this side, and over here we've got our battery. So there are a couple places you could put the MOSFET in this build. I've decided to put it up front here and have the switch wire double back. It's not necessary to do that. If you didn't use this white JST connector, you could cram it down in between there and then you'd have plenty of room, but I'm gonna do it this way. So I'm gonna put it approximately there, make sure it's out of the way of the flywheels, plenty of space. It's gonna go through this little channel there and then down through here. And then we're gonna pull up this switch real quick because I attempted to do this without pulling the switch up and it was not letting me get the wires in. So I suspect we don't have to pull this all the way up. Yeah, I might have to. Come on, autofocus. So I've pulled that switch up enough to get these 2 wires through there. And that will actually hold them wonderfully securely. I mean, it's like it's designed for that. That's a joke, you guys. So these are now your battery leads, and we are going to wire them so that this 550 GNB pack can fit inside here like this. It doesn't look like it, but there's actually ton of room in here without cutting these fins or anything. So I'm basically going to wire this in mind with being able to plug this connector and then shove the excess inside. Perhaps I would actually I'm going to do my extended grip, which is where the alarm will actually end up sitting. But I think what we'll want to do is just leave these long enough. Let's go with about there. You want to have enough lead that you don't have to struggle getting that connector in and out, because there's nothing worse than like battling with an XT60 connector, getting it inside of a blaster. So I'm just going to cut those, and I'm going to grab my connector. You want to make sure you've obviously got the correct connector. To wire in our XT30 connector, I like to use the other side of the connector to help reinforce the part as you're actually doing it. So you can just plug it in slightly. Normally I would do this with a jig that I've got, but since most people don't have that, I'm going to just show you the way that I would do it with a normal helping hands, which if you don't have helping hands at this point, you probably need some help. After you've stripped your wires, it's a good habit to get into is to always put heat shrink on there, even if you don't think you're going to need it. Like anytime you do any mod, just heat shrink anytime you strip a wire. I'm going to start with the red, the positive. Just insert that in there and give it a little twist to make sure it's staying put. I did not pre-tin this one because when I tried with the 18 gauge wire, 18 gauge is the maximum that you'll fit inside of an XT3060, an XT30 connector. I say XT60 so frequently because that's what our hobby has adapted. I can hardly remember. And we're just going to flux that until we see that it has filled the cup. You do want to be careful not to apply heat for too long, because if you do, you will eventually melt the connector. The connectors are made of nylon, but it is remarkably easy to melt them. Now, I like to shove that on while it's hot, because sometimes you get some free heat shrinkage there for you. It's worth noting, never solder a connector when the battery is connected to it unless you're being extra cautious to actually solder the battery itself. You can see this wire is just the maximum size you're going to get into that XT30 connector. And we'll do the second side. I for once did not drink too much coffee. It's looking good. And then I'll take my heat gun and just shrink those up real quick. You also can use a lighter, side of your soldering iron, or any other method you like to shrink those. Or don't use heat shrink and take a risk. Heat shrink's just there to stop a short. And I didn't mention, but the flat side is always positive. They are marked on any legitimate connector. Now that we've got our power side to our MOSFET, we've got our motor side and our switch left. I think we should do the switch next since it requires some backtracking, and then we're going to put the cage down over the top. So since I'm using this plug-in connector, I'm essentially going to plug in this other side and then follow this back to my switches. And since our switches are currently wired in line together, we're going to connect one to either end. Now, because this is just a switch, it is not carrying any current. It doesn't matter what switch or which wire you use for what. Despite being red and black, there's no polarity here at all. So we're going to take these switch wires and we're going to run them back under through where the power wires went, and hopefully I should be able to do this by pushing down on these other wires. If you have any problems, just loosen up your switch. I was able to do this. I'm running them this way because I would much rather they have a concrete out of the way path that I know isn't going to cause me problems later. And depending on how this looks in the final, I might put a little bit of hot glue just in this channel just to make sure that those don't move, because you really don't want your switches and things moving around. So now I've got the placement of that. That's looking good to me. Wire path goes, you want to make sure that there's plenty of slack because the cage is going to come down on top of that and those wires will get compressed down below. Then over here, we're going to wire one to the middle terminal. So I'm going to pull that switch up just so you can see it. I'm going to cut with a tiny bit of extra slack out there. Strip that guy. No. Going to strip that wire, and we're going to solder right to the middle terminal there. So I'm going to take, again, my helping hands, and we're going to plug that in. And there goes the switch cover. Next, this last wire is going to end up plugging in right here. So same thing, I'm gonna snip that. I might leave myself a little bit more room on this one to make it easier to actually strip. And same thing, if I can manage to get this in that hole, the solder lug, I certainly will. Try the other way. Now I'm going to try get this one through that solder lug if possible. Anytime I can get a positive physical connection, I will. Though I'm not having much luck, so I'll probably just solder to the surface there. And that should do just fine. All right, so now we can take our switch cover, put that back on, and slide this switch back into place. And then, if possible, tuck this wire as best we can sort of under and around this switch terminal, because we just want to make sure that that is totally out of the way. The last thing we want, again, is anything in the way of the actual firing mechanism. And I'll take just tucking all these switches. There is a nice path that they've built here. So make sure that those are all tucked all the way to the base of that channel. It's really quite an elegant little blaster when it comes down to it. Next, we're going to set up the cage before actually putting it into the wiring. We're going to use 2 out of darts Krakens and, of course, the Category-3 Hurricane cage. Now, Perry, my editor, came up with a great idea of, if you're wondering where the wiring needs to go in the motor placement, you can just copy workers. So make sure that you're lining up this indented edge here with the filleted, sort of smooth edge over here. And as long as those look the same, you're following the wiring and placement here. So we're going to take our red dots and match them here. So I've got the indented portion here. And they should be opposite each other because we are going to wire straight like this. I have to say, Worker agrees with my wiring. Take that, Drac. For anybody that doesn't know, Drac likes to do the little T wiring here, but for me, I like doing one less soldering joint, 2 less per blaster. So I like to give him flack for it frequently. So after you've placed your motors, you want to make sure that you can see the little brass collets, the bearings themselves sticking up a little bit. That's perfect. Then you're going to get a cage screw or 2. I suppose you're going to want 4, but I'm going to put a tiny bit of thread locker on there. You do really want thread locker. There's so much vibration at 37,000 RPM that you will run into these loosening up over time. These tiny little screws can work themselves out, and this is not a permanent thread locker. You could get this out if you wanted to later. And we carry a couple different kinds of this if you're looking for it. You want these screws to be completely flush after you've installed them. But you shouldn't have to put so much force on these stainless screws that you strip them in any way. It does help to have the correct screwdriver, which both a number 1 or number 0 seem very good. This one is, I have no idea anymore, but I'm pretty sure it's a 1. And it seems like an absolute perfect fit. It's one I've been using modding for years now, from iFixit of all places, when I used to try to repair a lot more electronics. So feel those, make sure that they are smooth, and once you've done that, it's always good to double check that it matches the original again. Now we're going to install the flywheels. These are just simple press on Flywheels, they have a little boss inside here that will stop them from being installed too deep. That will collide with the actual bearing there. So on these ones, you can actually just push until you feel them stop. Don't push super hard. You shouldn't have to wrench on them. There you go. And that's what they should look like. They should be even with each other. Again, good to check one last time before we start actually soldering. We want them to match that. We're going to grab our blaster shell. So with the install and wiring of the actual cage, you're going to want to make sure you're matching workers. There's this little notch up here, and this will flip upside down and sit here. So the way these wires are going to go is essentially like this is my recommended wiring, where they come up from the bottom rather than trying to squirrel them around down from the top. So you got plenty of slack here. Just make sure that you leave enough slack where you start. So I like to just lie those down, and you can either mark them, or in my case, mark them approximately where those cages are, but I'm actually just going to pull those up and put them into my wire strippers where I want them, and pull 2 parts up. So that'll be our bottom of our cage. And bear with me, because I'm actually going to make sure that I'm doing this correctly, because we definitely want to match. So yeah, we're like this. So we're going to wire basically like that. So I like to do my soldering in line like this, but I frequently will poke a little hole in between the solder and use the physical connection, in between the wire, excuse me, and use the physical connection of the wire to help cement this in place. And if you do this right, you can do this nice and cleanly where there's nothing touching anywhere important, but you can solder without the helping hands. And I find this speeds up because you don't spend any time clamping anything on. So here's our first one. I do not know what is going on with autofocus, but it's killing me. Okay, that looks good. Okay, so there's our first one. And we'll do the same for the second one. You can use a small screwdriver. You can also use the terminal itself, but for illustration purposes, I'm just going to show this. I've done this in my other videos, so if you've watched others, you've seen it. I just find it to be the easiest way. So you're sort of putting it on there and then going sideways, and it just holds it in place perfectly. And I think this is, to me, is like the ideal. It's my ideal anyway. Everybody can do it in their own way. There's not really a wrong way. As long as you're not hurting yourself and you're having fun, who cares? Now, I have just dripped a little bit of solder there, so we're going to make sure I clean that up. That second solder joint wasn't as clean as the first, but the important thing is that there's absolutely nothing touching that motor can. That's very important. Now, I like to use a Sharpie to mark exactly where I want the strip to be on those 2 terminals. That will allow me to grab this midline, and if I do it right, leave a little bit of extra tension. Yep. So what you want is you want a little flex in here. You don't want that to be so tight that it is pulling on the terminals, because with vibrations, you may find that causes some problems in the future as you're using it. It's not a common issue, but it is something that can happen. Don't ask me why I stripped that one in line when I didn't need to. I just needed to cut those. It's been a long day, everybody. Someone is probably laughing at me there. So I'm just going to snip off the excess. For those that don't know, I haven't said a whole lot about this publicly, but I have a newborn baby at home, and she is just something else. I am totally in love. I have 2 girls now, and I hope that someday they are really interested in Nerf. But I will say it does mean that I don't get quite as much sleep as I used to. So with this one, I'm going to shove it partially through this hole. Again, making sure that we've got a little bit of slack there. And then we'll solder that up. Now is a good time to check all of your solder joints and visually inspect that they all look clean and that nothing is touching. In my case, I actually see a little bit of a mistake. I have, where I clipped, there's a tiny bit looking like it could be touching something, and I just like to be extra sure that I haven't broken it. Okay, so that looks good. Now in my build here, I actually did make a little bit of a mistake. I let this pop out and we got to put it back in. It goes right here, but you actually can't get it in there while this switch is in place. So I'm going to quickly remove this switch and put it back in. So if you followed step by step with me, you may have done the same thing, or maybe you were smarter than me, or wiser. And then we're going to reinstall our actual trigger assembly here, if I can remember right orientation. There's a metal pin in the middle of there if you had that pop out, so you can just shove it in, it just sits loosely. And then you're going to want to tuck all these wires down. If you have any problems with them in your way, you can hot glue them, a little dab of hot glue, or even some you could even use some masking tape like Hasbro tends to use, but hot glue is probably my preferred method. And then check that your switch is working. This is going to want to leap out of the blaster, but once we close it up, it'll be better. Now we're going to actually test the blaster. I would recommend using a test pack like a nickel metal hydride or something lower current that isn't going to cause damage or pop if there's an issue. Another way you could do this is use your stock AA battery harness that came with this and use that to just bridge to test your pack to make sure that everything's wired up. I'm very confident on what I've done here, so I'm going to go ahead and plug this in. I'm going to hold the cage, make sure my fingers are clear of the cage, and we are going to first just test the trigger as is. And that means we've also got the back one on. So both triggers are on, and we are looking great. The spin direction is also correct. And I'm just going to test this back switch to make sure we've got that. I've now flicked it upwards, and now it doesn't work. So that's good to go too. Make sure you unplug this. Now we've actually got one last piece of demolition that I could not remember for the life of me whether it was necessary, and that's these little wings here on the shell. They are going to need to be ground out or cut out, and the reasoning is if you look at these shafts, the high performance cage from Foam Blast is actually a higher crush. It brings the wheels closer together, so the shafts no longer line up and you can't use the normal wire path. Now you can probably get at this with a snips, and you could cut these pieces out, or a flush cutters would be ideal for cutting flat surfaces. And normally I would use the flush cutters, can't seem to find them. We are still in transition, so I am going to pull out a Dremel, and we're going to Dremel out a few spots here. Now I'm going to mark them with a Sharpie just so you can see, but it's pretty easy to figure out what's causing problems. You essentially place your cage as you're intending to get it in, and since this blaster is clear on this one anyway, I can see on the back it is essentially these tabs here, right there, and then these two and that one. So I am going to go to the other side and mark those all. So it's all of those. That's pretty much it. So in theory, if I get all of those dremeled out, we should be good to go. So I'm going to do that now. It's worth noting with the dremeling here, I'm using this bit, but it's really not what I want. This is the bit I would normally use because it can grind nice and flat. It's going to be a lot safer. However, womp womp. not going to help me out very much today. So I believe I've gotten this all cleaned up here. I normally would not do this in out of order. I would do this before. So depending on whether we figured out a good way to edit this together to put it there, we may show this in the beginning. Now that we've got that all dremeled out, we're going to actually put our cage back in where it goes. We're going to tuck all these wires underneath the bottom screw boss. They need to be completely tucked in there. And same with the wires coming from the cages themselves. So if you can see that, they all end up underneath those screw bosses here and here. And then we're going to drop this in place. If you're doing a clear one, you can check on the back that you're actually getting a good alignment there. This is like the 5th time I've put this trigger back in. So normally if I had a hot glue gun handy, I would just hot glue the corner of that in to keep that permanent. So now that we've got that in place, we can actually put our 4 screws back in. This is really a fun little blaster, and it's a little bit tight inside compared to modding something like, say, a Strife, but it is a lot of fun to play with, and I think it's worth the effort that it takes to get it put together. It's really a pretty simple wiring, no matter whether you choose the MOSFET version or the standard version. If you're watching this far, you probably did the MOSFET along with me. I really do think that's the better option of the two. I did burn out a switch on one of my first ones that I did. All right, and then we check that the wheels are good. There's plenty of clearance in this blaster, so I wasn't exactly expecting any issues. Next, we're going to drop in this barrel, but I'm pretty sure there's this nub in the front that actually needs to be removed. I can just tell. So anytime I can do something with snips, I'm going to do it with snips, because Dremels make a huge mess. They're great tools and they're awesome to have, but they really just do make a massive mess. Now you do want to make sure that this barrel is seated all the way to the bottom. And you're going to drop that in, and then we are essentially ready to put the top shell back on and put everything back together. So the hardest part is just going to be getting that spring back in. It kind of needs to be tucked up into this little spot here. Hopefully this will probably be like nearly impossible to get on camera properly. You kind of want to put the spring in first, then push it into place. That wasn't so bad. And then you simultaneously need to get the switch into the slot where the switch is destined for. Some of these things doing on camera are really tricky because I'm trying to do them so you can see them, but then also not put my head over the camera, which is the natural place I would put is directly between the camera and you. I believe with a tiny screwdriver you could actually get down here, down these sides, to actually mess with them to help fix them. I can't seem to do that right now. But as long as you got those in and the shell is properly closed, you should have plenty of holding power on this mag. These hold these 2 little detents here. Yeah, that's feeling good. So I'm guessing most of that was not on camera, but I got them basically straight. They come from the factory, not perfect, but as long as there's enough tension there, you should be good. If you didn't already, you're going to need to flush cut the other side of this. You'll slide this in place. If this isn't as tight as you'd like it after you screw down your shell, you can use a little bit of hot glue. I kind of like that this shows off the MOSFET there. That's kind of fun. And now we are going to put all of our screws back in and close up the blaster and give it an actual test firing. So now we've completed the blaster, we can install our magazine, and the last thing to do is to plug in our battery and our LiPo alarm. Now, one of my complaints about this blaster was that there's no way to fit a LiPo alarm in the stock handle, at least not easily. You might be able to figure something out, but it's pretty difficult. So I would plug your LiPo in, and you could either, shove all the wiring up like that. Realistically, you're going to want to do the opposite, where you're going to kind of put the connector in alongside it. What we want is ultimately to end up with this balance plug out. Now, you could probably somehow manage to finagle and cram this and close that up, but what I did is I designed a screw-on locking mechanism. So this does two things. First, it makes the handle much more comfortable. My pinky rests nicely down below there, so for an adult hand, it feels very good. But second, it gives us room for an actual alarm. Now, you can do this one of two ways. You can use the standard LiPo alarm, very loud, and kind of wedge that in there and see if that'll work. But what I actually ended up doing was bending these 90 degrees. And I'll show you that really quick because I end up doing this with a lot of them. So those just have a 90-degree bend naturally, and as long as you bend them all carefully and support the board, you'll have no problem getting them to bend. And then at that point, it'll actually be even easier. Plug them in, put that in, and then we can close it. And that way, when it runs low, we know that we're safe. And there you have it. We are finally ready for an actual test fire. Super fun blaster. I just find this thing very satisfying. It's a fun little blaster and very unique. The see-through aesthetic is something that not everybody likes, but I think it's kind of neat overall. I didn't do a real clean job of this dremeling, especially since I didn't have the right tools. So you can take your time and do a better job with that. Or perhaps you're painting it anyway. I think that's what I'm going to do with this one since I made kind of a mess of it. I'll probably take the shells back apart and actually give this one of my paint jobs when I finally get my garage at home set up for painting. Thank you so much for watching. We are working to make the tutorials better here and spending more time on them. I have an editor now who's been phenomenal in getting things more fluid in our workflow, but we are still figuring everything out and trying to get things more polished. We would love to hear your feedback in the comments on what you want to see more in the tutorials, what other tutorials you want to see, and until next time, I'm out of darts.